Hello, I am Dr. Tanveer Sachdev and I teach literature in Government College for Women, Amritsar. William Wordsworth is one of the most important poets of English literature. He is preeminently a poet of nature. In fact, he was the Poet Laureate of England from 1843 till his death in the year 1850. I will first give you a brief biographical sketch of Wordsworth, place him in the context of the age in which he lived. Then I will go over the structure of the poem, introduce you to the poetic devices which Wordsworth has used in the poem, and then I'll take over the poem itself. Wordsworth was born in the year 1770 in the English Lake District, which is one of the most picturesque and beautiful parts of England. It is filled with lakes, rivers, hills, and rivulets. Wordsworth was the second of 5 children, and when he was barely 9 years old, his mother died. Soon after, when he was 13, his father also expired. The 5 siblings were separated, and Wordsworth was separated from his beloved sister Dorothy, and he would not meet her for the next 9 years. Wordsworth was sent to Hawkshead Grammar School, and his sister Dorothy was sent to live with relatives. By all standards, Wordsworth had a very disturbed childhood. In fact, even when his mother was alive, he stayed with his mother's relatives at Penrith. And here, he was exposed to the beautiful landscape and the moors all around. When he was barely a child, he learned to turn to nature for solace, particularly because of the harsh treatment that he received at the hands of his relatives. When he was 17, Wordsworth enrolled in St. John's College at Cambridge. Here also, he was not happy. He was dissatisfied with the monotonous routine of university education. Finally, he did graduate in the year 1791. But before that, before he finished his last semester, he went on a walking tour to the Alps in France and Italy. This experience gave him the opportunity to collect rich experiences which served the theme of his poems later. But more than that, the trip to France proved to be a turning point in his life. At that time, France was witnessing a very important event in its history, the French Revolution. The revolution, with its ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, fired the imagination of the young poet. After his graduation, he returned to France to participate in its exuberance in the later half of 1791. This monumental event had a very deep-seated effect on his mind. In fact, in one of his longer poems, The Prelude, Wordsworth mentions, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." Wordsworth identified with the ideas of the revolution and its ideal of establishing a heaven on earth. But later, the revolution turned into a nightmare. The reign of terror and the Jacobean movement that followed let loose a bloodbath in France. The revolution became so violent that the very ideas that it upheld were brutally violated. Rather than create political and intellectual freedom, it turned into tyranny and slaughter. The failure of the revolution completely shattered Wordsworth. It shattered him not because his political sympathies were in any way allied with the revolutionaries, but because he was misled by his emotions into too facile an acceptance. Wordsworth lost faith. He lost faith in himself, in his emotions, and even in his vocation as a poet. He felt that his emotion had failed him, so he turned to reason. But when reason also failed, Wordsworth faced a haze of spiritual death. Ultimately, he returned to England and settled down with his sister Dorothy, who remained his friend and companion throughout his life. He settled down in Dorsetshire. Once again, Wordsworth turned to nature to heal his wounds, for he firmly believed that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Spiritually bankrupt, it was nature which helped him to reaffirm his faith in the goodness and significance of the universe. In 1797, Wordsworth shifted to Somerset to live and work in close proximity with his friend and poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In 1798, they published the Lyrical Ballads together. The Lyrical Ballads is one of the most epoch-making books in English literature. It heralded the arrival of what is known as the Romantic movement in English literature. The last quarter of the 18th century was a time of great political upheaval in the West. There were revolutions, not only in France, the one we have just talked about, but also in the United States and in Ireland as well. In Great Britain also, a great political ferment was brewing up. It was against this backdrop that the Romantic movement in English poetry took shape. The main poets of this movement were Burns, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, and Keats. The Romantics were mainly iconoclastic, and they were iconoclastic both in their personal lives as well as in their poetical styles. They totally broke with tradition of 18th century neoclassical poetry, which was a poetry of rules and conventions. The 18th century poetry was a poetry that was basically a poetry of satire, political satire, and their style was also marked by imitation of classical Roman and Greek writers. And the Romantic poets mostly broke off with this tradition. If 18th century poetry was political, Wordsworth's poetry was subjective and confessional. If 18th century poetry was satirical, Wordsworth's poetry was emotional. And finally, if 18th century poetry was marked by an elaborate artificial diction, Wordsworth employed what he called the real language of men. His language was colloquial and simple. In fact, Shelley has called poets as the creators of language. He says that a poet's job is to refresh language for his society. And ultimately, what did poetry mean for Wordsworth? In his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, he mentions, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. It takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility." His poems deal with strong emotions like love, pity, joy, and grief. And mostly, they are a strong emotional response to some scene of nature. His poetry also establishes a very strong bond between nature, man, and God. He felt a powerful spirit presence in nature of what he called a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. And this is particularly true of his later poetry. Written in 1804, The Daffodils was first published in 1807 in a book called Poems in 2 volumes. Later, in 1815, Wordsworth revised the poem, and it is this poem which is current, which has survived, and which we shall study. It is one of his most famous poems. In fact, it is normally seen as a classic of Romanticism. It deals with the beauty of nature, unspoilt by humanity, and a reconciliation between man and his environment. The Daffodils is a lyric expression of the feelings of intense joy evoked by a natural scene. As far as the actual incident is concerned, Wordsworth saw the daffodils in the presence of his sister, Dorothy. In fact, Dorothy came back and gave a detailed account of them in her journal. But Wordsworth's poem was written much later, recollected in tranquility, as it were. In his poem, Wordsworth is not with Dorothy, but alone, probably because as he reviewed the experience over his mind, he arrived at an experience that was distinctly his own. Let's now take a look at the structure of the poem. The poem is 24 lines long and it is divided into 4 stanzas. So we have a sestet, that is, each stanza comprises of 6 lines. This sestet is further organized into a quartet, that is, of 4 lines followed by a couplet. And then it follows a particular rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme goes A, B, A, B, C, C. Look at the first stanza of the poem. Cloud in line 1 rhymes with crowd in line 3. Hills in line 2 rhymes with daffodils in line 4. And trees and frieze rhyme in line 5 and 6. Wordsworth used several images in his poem. He used the image of light, of color, and movement to develop the theme of the poem. The image of dance, for example, is integral to the poem, and it is linked with the idea of joy, of harmony, and of life itself. Each word or image evokes thoughts and feelings that are associated with them. In fact, Wordsworth uses a number of similes, comparing himself to a cloud and the daffodils with stars. Now, before we go over the poem, we must examine 2 basic concepts. Number 1, what is a simile? And number 2, what is an image? Now, the first question first. What is a simile? A simile basically is a figure of speech that compares 2 things that are unlike in all ways, except one particular way. It is often introduced with the words like or as. For example, Samuel was a record-breaking runner and he ran as fast as a speeding bullet. Here, Samuel is being compared to the bullet. Obviously, Samuel is a human being and a bullet is a piece of ammunition, and the 2 are absolutely different things. But what we are comparing here is their speed. Take another example. Ashley's anger is as explosive as a volcano. Here also the simile is explicit. Ashley and the volcano are distinct objects, but it is the suddenness and the violence of the volcano which is compared to Ashley's anger. Now let's take up the second question. What is an image? Poets and philosophers have been debating over these questions without coming to any definite answer. But if you look at it very simply, images are word pictures that poets use to develop thoughts and feelings. They are used for dramatic effect, to evoke thoughts and feelings associated with an image. For example, Robert Burns compares his beloved to a rose in very famous lines. My love is like a red, red rose that is newly sprung in June. Here, the beauty, the perfection, and the freshness of the rose is compared to his beloved. These ideas are immediately transferred onto the beloved, and the poet needn't say anything more. His work is done. But a more literary definition of the image is given by Ezra Pound, and he says that an image is an emotional and intellectual complex in an instant of time. Now, what does this mean? This means that an image is not only a mental picture, it is far more. It's not merely a visual picture. It can employ any of the senses depending upon the sensory detail that we are using. The sunlight in a lemon makes me wince. The words here do not merely stand for an abstract object, that's the lemon. The image touches us in 3 ways. It touches us in a sensory manner, it touches us in an intellectual way, and also an emotional manner. From the point of view of sensory perception, also it touches us in 2 ways. The sense of sight and the sense of taste, which is sour. The image of the sunlight immediately brings to mind the brilliance and the vibrance of the yellow color of the lemon. But it can be seen from an intellectual standpoint also. And here we have to know how the sunlight acts upon the lemon and converts it into energy or vitamin C. And finally, there's the emotional component, and that depends on whether the speaker who is eating the lemon likes it or not. And the instant of time is the moment of the speaker eating the lemon. In the daffodils also, the image of the breeze is an image that we do not merely see. Of course, we can feel the breeze through the swaying of the trees, but it is also a tactile image, an image that can be felt. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in a never-ending line along the margin of the bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. The poem opens with a full evocation of the poet's state of mind. Wordsworth is loitering alone, aimlessly in a state of loneliness and dejection. The poet personifies himself as a cloud that is floating over valleys and hills. The simile that he chooses here is that of a single cloud and not of an overcast sky. And this is significant because it serves to heighten the sense of partial estrangement and isolation of the poet. The cloud is moving well over valleys and hills, not coming close to them or touching them. And it is this which emphasizes the poet's isolation. The clouds that move are not strongly touched by the blowing breeze, which is always a symbol of creative joy and inspiration in Wordsworth. In fact, what Wordsworth is highlighting here is that he is lonely and not the fact that he is alone or solitary. The sudden appearance of the daffodils upon the scene breaks through this mood of loneliness and detachment, and he comes upon the daffodils in sudden and pleasant surprise. And he says, "All at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils." The daffodils are growing in large numbers beside the lake, underneath the trees. They are fluttering and dancing with the breeze that is blowing over them. The mood of pensiveness is broken, and suddenly Wordsworth is engulfed in a flood of emotion. The focus now shifts from the poet to the scene that is there before him. The poet moves from a confused, vague fluttering of flowers to a realization that this movement is actually synchronized like a dance. Wordsworth uses the image of the dance to heighten the contrast between his own state of mind and the daffodils, which are reverberating in sheer joy, which are celebrating the simple act of living and being. The daffodils are celebrating the one life that penetrates through all things, and they are already in harmony with it, unlike Wordsworth. In this entire creation, man is the only one who is capable of feeling not at home and wanders as a cloud. But unlike the cloud, he is deeply aware of his loneliness. On the contrary, the daffodils are fixed by natural law, celebrating the simple joy of simply being and existing. The next stanza opens with a description of the daffodils. The image of movement assumes importance in this stanza, movement both of the flowers as well as of water. In fact, Wordsworth himself said that the whole object of my poem is trouble or agitation both of flowers and of the water. The poet compares the daffodils to the stars that shine in the heavens. Growing along the curve of the lake, they remind him of the stars that shine along the curve of the heavens. They seem to be as numerous as the stars in the night sky. In fact, if you look up at the night sky, you can take in the immeasurability of the stars in a single glance. Similarly, Wordsworth took in hundreds and thousands of daffodils in a single glance. But there's a difference here. The daffodils are not stationary. They are acted upon by the breeze, tossing their heads about, reverberating in joy. The third stanza continues on the same note. The sense of joy is carried from the flowers dancing in the breeze to the water in the lake. The breeze that acts upon the flowers also acts upon the waves in the lake, making the waves join in a spontaneous dance. But the sparkling waves, shimmering in the breeze, are no match for the daffodils, which are dancing in sheer exuberance. In fact, Wordsworth sees a far more joyful life in the flowers, which he says outdid the sparkling waves in glee. Over here, breeze becomes an important image because of the movement that it is imparting to the flowers and the water. In fact, according to one of the critics, Perkins, he says that throughout Wordsworth's poetry, breeze is a loaded image. It speaks of the wind as a ubiquitous presence that fills or moves through the natural things with which it communes. The daffodils and the waves beside them seem to possess a life of their own. In fact, life for the poet is synonymous with motion. In their movement, the waves and the flowers express this one life that blows through them. I mentioned earlier that Wordsworth was a pantheist and he felt the presence of a universal life force in nature. This being that moves through all things is the principle of joy, the pleasure that is there in life itself. This life that rolls through all things imparts joy and glee to the flowers and the waves, and they are already in harmony with it. And through them, Wordsworth also touches this primary life force, this universal life force. He is touched by this one life and shares the same primary joy and happiness with the flowers and the waves. And now there is total harmony between nature, man, and God. At another level, the breeze is also a symbol of creative joy and inspiration. The breeze that blows over the lake and the flowers is the natural equivalent of the breeze of poetic glee that is now blowing through Wordsworth's mind. The flowers and the waves are happy and joyous, and so is Wordsworth, because now his mind, like them, is active. In fact, in romantic thought, poets were considered godlike. They were akin to God because, like him, they were co-creators. They created with their imagination. final stanza, the poet dwells on the renovative effect of the scene upon him. The daffodils become a permanent spot of time in his memory. They lift his spirit and enrich his life forever. But this realization of the rejuvenating power of the scene comes to him much later than the moment of perception. The poet discloses that whenever he is lonely or in a sad or pensive mood, the daffodils flash into his mind and fill him with delight and happiness. In later years, in other moods of loneliness and despair, he recollects that joyful experience of the spring morning. Now, what is important here is that it is not merely the beauty of the daffodils that he is recalling. It is not merely the beauty of the daffodils that gives him this rejuvenating power, but the remembrance of the experience he had, the experience of total joy and harmony with nature, with man and God. Wordsworth had experienced this one life that blew in the daffodils and touched the being of the poet. The wealth which is stored up for future years is created by the poet's own imagination, which transforms into vividness and brightness the most trivial and commonplace of incidents. The daffodils become a treasure cove to which the poet returns again and again. The spontaneous joy of the first emotion is replaced by a more reflective one. Now, the poet talks of the bliss of solitude, which is very different from the melancholy loneliness in the beginning of the poem.